You spit into a little plastic tube. Seal it, drop it in a prepaid envelope, and a few weeks later, a website tells you your great-great-grandmother came from a village you can't pronounce. You read it out at dinner, somebody laughs. That's the whole ritual now. A little saliva, a barcode, an answer. Point that same tube at a different question, and the laughter stops. Because the technology in that cheap kit quietly closed a case that stayed open for the entire human story. A question people once exiled each other over, killed each other over, built whole moral codes trying to manage. A father wants to know one thing: is this child mine? And for almost all of the time there have been fathers, the honest answer was, no one alive can tell you. Not the mother, not the elder, not the wisest person in the valley. There was no test. There would never be one. Not for him, not for his son, not for the long chain of sons after that. Picture your own life exactly as it is, with a single capacity quietly deleted: the ability to ever be certain your child is yours. Not probably, not well, she's got my chin. Certain, gone, and never once on offer. You will still raise this child. Feed her, defend her, hand her everything you claw together across a lifetime. All of it, on a hunch you can never upgrade to a fact. A mother never lived inside that hunch. She felt the pregnancy grow. She did the labor. The child arrived out of her own body with half the camp watching. Whatever else the ancient world left uncertain, the weather, the hunt, whether the winter would end you, motherhood was not on the list. She knew. He didn't. He couldn't. And not because ancient men were fools. This is just the plumbing of mammal reproduction. Fertilization happens on the inside, unwitnessed, out of reach of the eye. So a man sits permanently on the blind side of the one thing he most needs to see. Biologists give it a flat, almost bored little name: paternity uncertainty. 2 dull words. Under them sits what may be the oldest anxiety our species carries around. And it's worth noticing how deep that asymmetry cuts, because it isn't a small imbalance you could shrug off. It's total. There is no partial credit here, no 70% sure. A mother's knowledge is absolute and effortless. It arrives with the birth itself, unbidden. A father's knowledge is zero and unreachable, no matter how faithful his partner, no matter how closely he watches, no matter how badly he wants it. 2 people, standing over the same crib, living in 2 completely different relationships to a single fact. She is inside certainty. He is locked outside it, with his face pressed to glass he can never break. And the strangest part isn't the anxiety. It's how absurdly recently we escaped it. We didn't crack this in antiquity. We hadn't cracked it when we raised the pyramids, or drew the first maps, or flew to the moon. Real proof of fatherhood is so new that your own grandparents lived their whole young lives without it. Early in the 20th century, blood group typing could occasionally tell a man a child definitely wasn't his. A cold, one-directional verdict. It could rule a man out. It could never once rule him in. The confirming answer, the actual yes, only shows up with DNA testing in the 1980s and 90s. That's the entire window. 2, maybe 3 human lifetimes ago. Set that against the age of us. Homo sapiens runs back somewhere past 300,000 years. Certainty about fatherhood is roughly 40 years old. Take every father who has ever lived, from the first of our kind to the man who raised you, and stand them in one unbroken line, reaching back over the curve of the earth. Only the last sliver of that line, the few standing right at the near end, ever got to know. Every other father, thousands of them fading off toward the horizon, spent his whole life guessing. Loving on trust, betting everything on a maybe. You'd think a species this clever would simply make peace with that. File it under things you can't measure and move on. But that isn't what we did, because that isn't what the stakes allowed. Uncertainty you can ignore when nothing rides on it. Nobody loses sleep over a coin they'll never flip. Ride your whole genetic future on that same coin, hidden in a closed fist for a lifetime, and ignoring it stops being an option your mind will permit. That single unanswerable question did not sit politely in a corner for 300 millennia. It went to work on us. It reached into how we pair off, who we trust, what we forbid, what we call sacred, and yes, into that specific hot, ugly jolt that goes through you when someone you love laughs a beat too long at another person's joke. You think that jolt is yours? Private? A personal flaw in your wiring, or a warning about theirs? I'm gonna try to talk you out of that. But before we reach what this question did to your heart, we have to face what it did to the men who couldn't answer it, and why for them guessing wrong wasn't merely humiliating. It was the end of their line. Put yourself back in that line, but not near the front where the tube lives. Go deep into the crowd, 100,000 years back, in a small band that is the only human world you will ever know. 40, maybe 50 people. Beyond them, nothing but land and weather and things with teeth. Here is your position, and I want you to feel its mass, not just agree with it. You're not a modern man idly wondering about a question he'll never actually be forced to answer. You are a father of the Pleistocene, and the child sleeping against your partner is the single largest investment you will ever make. Everything runs through it, the meat you haul back instead of swallowing where you stand. The years you burn teaching instead of resting. The nights you wedge your own body between that child and the cold. No shops, no stored grain. No one coming to help. A child lives only because adults pour themselves into it, year after year, and you are one of those adults, emptying yourself into a small life on faith. Most people rush past the next fact, so let's not. Among mammals, deeply invested fathers are rare, and human fathers are among the rarest of all. Run down the roster of our closest relatives, and the males mostly appear, do the one biological thing, and evaporate. A male chimpanzee is not saving anyone a share of the kill or teaching anyone to nap a blade. Human males did something bizarre by mammal standards. They stayed, they provisioned, they defended. They invested for years, sometimes for the length of a childhood. Evolutionary biology treats this heavy male investment as one of the genuinely unusual moves our lineage made, and it's the hinge the entire problem turns on. Because heavy investment welded to deep uncertainty is a savage combination. Follow it the way a cold-eyed biologist would. Every scrap you spend on this child is a scrap not spent on your own survival or on a child who truly carries your line forward. If she's yours, that spending is the finest bet in nature. You are buying a future that outlives you. But if she isn't, you've done the one thing evolution punishes without mercy, emptied your single finite life into carrying a rival's genes into the next generation while your own quietly go extinct. You didn't just lose. You spent everything you had helping another man win, and you rocked his child to sleep believing it was your own victory. Nature does not tolerate that mistake for long. This is where Robert Trivers comes in, the biologist who, in the early 1970s, laid out parental investment theory, the framework underneath all of this. Its logic is pitiless. When a behavior is that expensive to get wrong, selection bears down on it. Any instinct, any flicker of wiring that nudged an ancestral male toward pouring his effort into his own offspring rather than a stranger's, tended to survive into the next round. The men who felt nothing, who invested blind and never once flinched, were the men most likely to spend a lifetime raising a line that wasn't theirs and to have less of themselves left in the generations that followed. Across enough time, felt nothing thins out of the population. What rides down into you instead is the inheritance of the men who cared, sharply, restlessly. And they cared about something they could never verify. There's the jaw of the trap. A high-stakes question is one thing. A high-stakes question with no reachable answer, chewing on you for an entire life, is another animal entirely. He could watch, he could suspect, he could hunt a small face for a familiar line of the jaw. She's got her father's eyes. For most of our history, that wasn't a soft thing, an ant murmurs over a cradle. It was a man running the only forensic test he owned, on evidence he half knew was worthless, because infants are soft and shifting, and half the band shares the same brow anyway. Less a compliment than a wish spoken aloud, begging a baby's face to confirm what nothing else on the planet could. So hold the two halves together, because their collision drives everything that follows. On one side, a cost so brutal that selection carved men into caring about paternity as if their existence depended on it, because in the only currency evolution counts, it did. On the other, a question so sealed by our own biology that no man, however sharp, however desperate, could pry a true answer out of it. Maximum stakes, zero information. Hand a whole species that exact tension. Give it 300,000 years. Call it 12,000 generations, parent to child, each one carrying the same itch it cannot reach. Pressure like that doesn't evaporate. It has to go somewhere. It has to build something. So the question waiting at the end of this part is simple and a little unnerving. If you are clever enough to feel a problem this sharply, but nowhere near clever enough, not for another 300 millennia, to actually solve it, what do you do with all that fear instead? You don't solve it. You start building around it. And what our species built is enormous. So enormous that a lot of us are still living inside the walls. You can't answer the question. Accept that. But you can rig the world so the question comes up far less often. Narrow the situation until the guess gets easier. That's the whole move. And our species reached for it again and again, on continent after continent, with no one comparing notes. Look at the institutions we raised and let your eyes unfocus, and a pattern surfaces that's hard to unsee. Start with marriage. A public, witnessed, socially enforced claim. This person and this person, everyone in the band, a witness. Real consequences for stepping outside the line. Notice what marriage does at the mechanical level. It isn't there to manufacture love. Plenty of historical marriages had nothing to do with love. It narrows the field. It shrinks the pool of plausible fathers toward one, so the impossible guess becomes a merely difficult one. Then everything else stacks on top. Legitimacy, the idea that a child born inside the arrangement counts, inherits, belongs, while a child born outside it is quietly demoted. Bride price and dowry, whole economies of cattle and silver moving between families to seal the claim. Chaperoning, seclusion. A dense thicket of custom, and a striking share of it aims in one direction, at the movements and choices of women, specifically. Anthropologists who compare these institutions across hundreds of unrelated societies keep noticing the same lopsidedness. The suspicion, the surveillance, the punishment fall disproportionately on wives and daughters rather than on husbands and sons. And when you ask why that same asymmetry keeps reappearing in cultures that never touched each other, one powerful answer is the thread we've been pulling. These customs work, in part, as paternity confidence machinery. Nobody sat down and designed them for that. They accreted, generation by generation, as a patch stretched over a hole in human biology no single man could ever close on his own. Now I have to pull hard on the reins, because this is the exact bend where a story like this flies off the road. It is tempting and lazy to march out of here declaring that marriage is really about paternity, that every veil and locked gate is really a man guarding his bloodline. That's a swindle, and you should distrust anyone selling it that clean. These institutions are overdetermined, a heavy word that just means many strong causes at once. Marriage is also an alliance between families, a way to pool labor, a machine for moving property, a religious act, an answer to who feeds whom in old age. The rules pressed onto women's lives are also about economics, about naked power, about honor systems that grew grotesque lives of their own long after anyone remembered why. Paternity anxiety is one strand in that rope. A real one, maybe even a load-bearing one. But yank it out and wave it around as the whole rope, and you've stopped doing anthropology and started doing mythology. Hold it as a lens then, not a verdict. Angled right, it lights the room. Push too hard, it warps everything it touches. Both are true, and a serious mind keeps both in hand at once. But there's one strand of this that climbs straight out of the ethnography and lands on you personally, so let's follow that one home. The hot feeling, jealousy. Some researchers studying sex differences have looked at how men and women describe their jealousy and reported a recurring gap in emphasis, a gap many read through this very frame. The interpretation runs like this. For an ancestral man, one particular betrayal carried a unique catastrophe, precisely because of the blind spot we've spent this whole video standing beside. He alone risked pouring a lifetime into a genetic stranger. Her nightmare was just as real, but shaped differently. She never doubted the child was hers. What she stood to lose was his investment, his protection, redirected to someone else's child. I'm raising both hands over this one. It is interpretation, not settled law. The findings are contested, the methods get argued to pieces, and thoughtful scientists genuinely disagree about how much is ancient wiring and how much is culture drilling men and women to perform jealousy from different scripts. Take it as one influential reading of a tangled human feeling, not a fact chiseled into rock. Even so, look hard at the shape of the claim. It suggests that the ugliest, most private spasm you've ever felt, that clench in the gut, that sudden animal conviction that something is wrong, might not be a personal failing at all. It might be an alarm older than farming, tuned for a danger you will almost surely never meet, going off inside a mind that could, if it chose, simply order the test and end the argument. That is the cage most of humanity built. Since you can't answer the question, control the situation around it. Watch, fence, formalize, punish. It worked, after a fashion, for thousands of years. But it was never the only thing our species did. Somewhere out beyond the reach of all that fencing, a few cultures looked at the identical impossible question, and flatly refused to play. They didn't build a higher wall. They walked around the whole problem and answered the unanswerable with a trick so clean it feels like getting away with something. The cage has one problem its builders rarely admit. It costs a fortune to run. All that watching and fencing and punishing is a mountain of effort bolted onto a question you still can't actually answer. So imagine being clever enough to skip the whole apparatus, to look at the blind spot everyone else is clawing at and think, why am I standing here at all? Some societies did precisely that, and the first of their solutions is so clean it belongs in a logic textbook. Go back to the one fact in this entire story that never wobbles. Motherhood is certain. She gives birth, the camp watches, it is locked. So stop chasing certainty through the men where it can't be caught and route it through the women where it already flows. Watch what happens. A man can never be sure of his own children. But he can be flint certain that his sister's children carry his own family's blood, because his sister shares his mother, and that maternal line is beyond suspicion. Her kids are a sure thing, his own are a hope. So a whole set of matrilineal cultures made a move that sounds deranged until it clicks into focus. A man's inheritance, his standing, his role as the shaping male in a child's life, pass not to his own children, but to his sisters. Anthropologists call it the avunculate, from the Latin for a mother's brother, and it surfaces again and again in societies with no contact between them. The uncle provides, the uncle instructs, the uncle hands down what he has built, and the biological father drifts into a warmer, looser role, off to one side of the ledger, freed from an accounting he could never have balanced anyway. Feel the nerve of that. While much of humanity is straining to force a yes out of a question that has none, these cultures simply decline to ask it. They found the one channel where certainty was already running and poured the whole inheritance down it. And here's the tell that this is no fluke. The same answer appears independently, over and over in matrilineal societies that never traded a word. When a solution keeps reinventing itself in isolation, you're not looking at a quirk. You're looking at the logic of the situation forcing its own hand wherever people chase it far enough. That's the first escape, sidestep the men entirely. The second is stranger, and it grows out of the lowland forests of South America, and the first time you hear it, you laugh. Then you stop laughing. In several Amazonian societies, documented in the ethnography of peoples such as the Bari and the Ashe, people simply did not believe a child had exactly one father. Their working model of conception was cumulative. A baby gets built up over the course of a pregnancy from every man the mother is with. Lie with her, and you contribute to the child. All of you do. The child, quite officially and without scandal, has more than one father. Biologically, that is not how babies are made, and everyone in the room knows it. But watch what the belief does out in the world, because this is where it stops being a punchline. If a child can have several recognized fathers, then several men hold a stake in that child's life. Several men bring it food. Several men keep an eye on it when the forest turns dangerous. And the anthropologists who studied these groups found something sobering in the survival records. In at least some of them, children with more than one acknowledged father were more likely to reach adulthood. In a world where a second reliable provider could be the exact margin between a child who lives and a child who doesn't, spreading the fatherhood wasn't reckless. It was insurance. Sit with the sheer audacity of that inversion. Most of humanity treated the uncertainty as a threat to be locked down, the thing that made jealousy flare and rules tighten. These cultures took the identical fact and turned it into an asset. You can't be sure who the father is? Then let him be several, and let the child gather more protectors than a certain answer would ever have allowed. Where one society saw a hole to be guarded day and night, another saw a resource to be shared out. Two escapes, then. One channels certainty through the sister's line and lets the uncle carry the future. The other dissolves the question by scattering it across every possible answer at once. Neither one policed a woman's body. Neither one built the cage. And both raised real children who lived to have children of their own for thousands of years on a foundation utterly unlike ours. Which drops a quietly unsettling question right in your lap. If a single unanswerable fact could be met with a locked gate in one place and an open circle of fathers in another, then how much of what you privately call how love is supposed to work is timeless human truth? And how much is just the particular bookkeeping system you happen to be born into? Turn that one over tonight. And if this is the kind of question you'd rather have more of than less, subscribe. Prying up the floorboards under things you assumed were simply human nature is the entire point of this channel. Because there's one loop we still have to close. Every one of these societies, the cage builders and the cage refusers alike, was wrestling a problem that was, for them, genuinely unsolvable. It isn't unsolvable now. The answer fits in a plastic tube on a bathroom shelf. So why does the old fear still run in you? In a mind that could settle the whole thing in an afternoon and mostly decides not to. Let's close the distance between then and now, because it's shorter than it feels and far stranger. Start with the fact that should, by every right, have switched this whole machine off. When researchers actually measure how often a child's presumed father isn't the biological one, misattributed paternity in the jargon, the number comes back small. Not zero, but modest. Typically a low single-digit share in most populations that have been studied, with the occasional outlier group running higher. Weigh that against everything we've just walked through. The cage, the veils, the punishments, the uncle inheriting a sister's children, the Amazonian circle of shared fathers, 300,000 years of men interrogating infant faces for a resemblance, an ocean of machinery and anguish raised around an event that turns out, most of the time, to be fairly rare. But of course, they couldn't know the number. That is the cruel joke sitting at the center of all of it. The very figure that would have calmed those men is a modern figure, squeezed out of the one test they never had. Their fear was never calibrated to the real odds. It was calibrated to the not knowing itself. And that is the hinge the entire ending turns on, because it explains why the test didn't set us free. The feeling was never tuned to reality. It was tuned to uncertainty, to the blind spot, not to whatever was actually standing in it. So here's the whole thought stated plainly, the one this entire video has been walking toward. A mother always knew her child was hers. A father never could, not once, not ever, until a little saliva a few decades ago finally answered it. That single permanent gap, motherhood certain and fatherhood a guess, is one of the quiet engines under human behavior. The jealousy that grips men, the rules, cultures wrapped around women's bodies, the invention of marriage and legitimacy, even a few threads of our morality, a startling amount of it reads as our species straining and failing across 12,000 generations to close one question our own biology held shut. And I'll say it as flatly as I promised. This is a lens, a strong one, not a proven law. Culture, economics, and raw power built these institutions too, working alongside the old fear, not underneath it. Anyone who hands you a version where it's just one cause is selling you a story tidier than the truth. But keep the lens up for one last look, because now it turns toward you. You are, in the plainest statistical sense, among the first humans in that entire horizon-spanning line who could simply know. The answer that stayed out of reach for every father behind you now sits on a shelf one afternoon away. You could end, before dinner, the doubt that gnawed on 300,000 years of men. And yet the feeling is still in there. The lurch when someone you love lingers a little too warmly in another conversation. The flash of something hot and old and wordless that arrives before you've decided anything that you're faintly ashamed of, that you'd never once call by its true name. You think it's yours. You think it's personal. A crack in your character. A soft spot in your love. It isn't only yours. It's inherited. It's the residue of every man who ever searched a small face for his own features and found only a hope he couldn't confirm. It's an alarm built for a danger you will almost certainly never face, wired into a brain that now, for the first time in the history of the species, holds the off switch in its own hand. The fear came down to you fully loaded and ready to fire. The remedy showed up about 40 years ago. Your instincts never got the message, and they may never get it, because instinct doesn't read the news. So the next time that feeling closes its hand around you, that ancient involuntary lurch, you might catch something none of the men in that long line ever could. That you aren't simply feeling a private emotion. You're feeling the ghost of a question that couldn't be answered, still firing inside a mind that finally could answer it and mostly chooses to let it ride. 12,000 generations of not knowing, humming quietly inside a person who could resolve it with a bit of spit and a barcode. Every one of them would have traded everything they owned for the certainty you carry around and barely think about. And here you are, holding it, still flinching at shadows they would have recognized instantly and without a word as their own. One real question before you go, and I mean it as the actual close of this conversation, not a sign-off. Now that you can see where that feeling comes from, that it runs older than farming, older than any language you'd recognize as speech, does naming it as something ancient make it any lighter to set down? Or does it just make the weight easier to carry? Tell me below, I read them. And if you want to keep lifting the floorboards on the instincts you always assumed were simply you already know what to do.